high security. These men are threatening me. Get them out of first class before they hurt someone.
The words sliced through the quiet luxury of Platinum Elite Airways' private terminal like a blade through silk. Sharp, desperate, and completely untrue. Victoria Ashworth's voice carried the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what she wanted when she wanted it simply by raising her tone and expecting the world to bend to her will. Her manicured finger adorned with a diamond that could have paid for a small house pointed dramatically toward two men who had done nothing more threatening than walk down an airplane aisle with their boarding passes in hand. What Victoria didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 18 minutes, the woman screaming about threats would lose everything she owned, and the two men she was trying to have removed would own the airline she was flying on. But first she had to learn that hoodies can cost more than houses, and that judging people by their appearance in today's world isn't just wrong, it's financially catastrophic. Before we dive into this story, I want you to think about something. Have you ever been looked at and immediately dismissed before you even opened your mouth? Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight of assumptions crash down on you like a wave? If you have, drop your city in the comments below, because this story is for you. And if you believe that respect should be given freely, not earned through designer labels, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in justice. The setting was Miami International Airport's most exclusive terminal, a marble and glass sanctuary where privacy came with a 7-figure price tag and champagne flowed like water. Flight PE007 to London Heathrow sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its pristine white fuselage gleaming under the Florida sun. This wasn't just any flight. This was Platinum Elite's crown jewel, a private aircraft that charged $25,000 per seat and delivered an experience that made commercial first class look like economy. Cameron Mitchell stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his frame filling out a charcoal gray hoodie that looked deceptively simple to the untrained eye. What most people couldn't see was that this particular piece of clothing had been handcrafted in Milan by artisans who charged $8,000 for the privilege of wearing their work. His feet were encased in sneakers that hadn't hit the market yet, prototypes from a collaboration between a legendary basketball player and a luxury fashion house worth more than most people's cars. Around his neck hung a chain so understated it looked like costume jewelry, but the pendant was actually a custom-designed biometric key worth more than a suburban home. Devin Mitchell was identical to his brother in every way that mattered, though those who knew them well could spot the subtle differences. Where Cameron's eyes held a spark of controlled intensity, Devin's carried a quieter, more calculating energy. His hoodie was the same Italian masterpiece, his sneakers equally exclusive, but where Cameron wore silver, Devin preferred platinum. They moved with the synchronized grace of two people who had spent 28 years thinking as one mind in two bodies. Both brothers looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from 96 straight hours of high-stakes coding protecting systems that most people never knew existed. Their eyes were rimmed with red, their usually perfect posture slightly slouched from carrying the weight of keeping the Federal Reserve's cybersecurity protocols from being breached by hostile foreign actors. They had literally spent the last 4 days saving American financial infrastructure from collapse, and now all they wanted was to sleep in the lie-flat seats they had paid for during their flight to London. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who had built something extraordinary from nothing, who had taken their brilliant minds and transformed them into a company that protected governments, banks, and corporations from digital threats that could topple economies. Their duffel bags, which looked like standard gym bags to casual observers, contained laptops holding proprietary algorithms worth more than the gross domestic product of some small nations. As they walked through the private terminal, the atmosphere around them shifted in subtle ways. Other passengers, dressed in obviously expensive clothing and dripping with status symbols, glanced at them with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. This was a space where appearance mattered more than capability, where the right watch could open doors that talent and intelligence could not, The terminal itself was a monument to exclusivity with its soaring ceilings, imported marble floors, and artwork that belonged in museums. Every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that money could buy, and the air carried the faint scent of expensive perfume and leather. It was designed to make the ultra-wealthy feel at home, and to make anyone who didn't belong to their world feel immediately and obviously out of place. Cameron checked his platinum Patek Philippe watch, a gift he had bought for himself the day TechGuard Solutions landed their first $100 million government contract. Flight PE-007 was scheduled to depart in 45 minutes, and they needed every minute of flight time to prepare for the most important business meeting of their lives. Tomorrow morning, they would sit across from European defense contractors and sign papers that would make their company the exclusive cybersecurity provider for NATO's most sensitive operations. It was a deal worth $500 million, and it would cement their position as the most powerful cybersecurity firm in the world. Devon adjusted his noise-canceling headphones, custom-made by the same company that provided audio equipment for recording studios and space programs. The brothers had learned long ago that the best way to avoid unwanted attention was to appear completely absorbed in their own world, to present themselves as unremarkable as possible, while moving through spaces where their presence might be questioned. They approached the departure gate with the calm efficiency of people who traveled frequently and knew exactly how these interactions were supposed to go. They had their boarding passes ready, their identification prepared, and their luggage properly tagged. Everything was in order, everything was legitimate, and everything was about to go terribly wrong. The gate area was a study in understated luxury, with leather seating that cost more per square inch than most people's monthly rent, and personal service representatives who catered to every whim of their exclusive clientele. Digital displays showed departure information in multiple languages, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the aircraft that would carry them across the Atlantic in unprecedented comfort. As they settled into the waiting area, Cameron pulled out his phone to review the final details of tomorrow's presentation. The screen displayed charts and graphs that represented months of preparation strategies for protecting critical infrastructure that could mean the difference between national security and international chaos. Devon opened his laptop and began running final diagnostics on the algorithms they would be demonstrating, ensuring that every line of code was perfect. Neither brother paid attention to the woman seated across from them, who was staring with increasing intensity and growing displeasure. They were focused on their work, on their mission, on the responsibility they carried for protecting the digital backbone of modern civilization. They had no way of knowing that their presence in this exclusive space had already been judged unacceptable, and that forces were already in motion to remove them from a seat they had every right to occupy. Victoria Ashworth had spent 52 years learning how to get her way, and she had never encountered a situation where her combination of beauty, wealth, and sheer force of will had failed to produce the results she desired. She sat in the gate area like a queen holding court, her platinum blonde hair arranged in a perfect chignon that had taken 3 hours and $1,500 to achieve that morning. Her dress was a masterpiece of Italian design, flowing cream-colored silk that draped across her surgically enhanced figure with the precision of architecture, and every piece of jewelry she wore could have funded a small business for a year. She had been born beautiful, married strategically, and divorced lucratively. Her ex-husband, pharmaceutical CEO Marcus Ashworth, had built his fortune by acquiring smaller companies and raising the prices of life-saving medications to levels that maximized profit while minimizing public outrage. When their marriage had finally collapsed under the weight of his affairs and her spending the divorce settlement had left her with $200 million, 3 homes, and a lifestyle that required constant validation of her superiority over everyone around her. Victoria's world was carefully constructed around the belief that certain people belonged in certain places, and that those hierarchies were not just natural but necessary for maintaining order in society. She had never questioned why she deserved luxury while others did not, never examined the assumptions that allowed her to look at 2 brilliant men and see only threats to her comfort. Her position in Seat 1C of the aircraft gave her a perfect view of everyone who boarded, and she had already made mental notes about each passenger's worthiness to share her airspace. The elderly businessman in the expensive suit had received her approving nod. The younger woman in designer clothing had earned a slight smile. But when Cameron and Devin Mitchell had walked down the aisle in their hoodies and sneakers, Victoria's carefully maintained composure had cracked like thin ice. Sofia Rodriguez had been working as a senior flight attendant for Platinum Elite Airways for 12 years, and in that time she had developed an expertise in reading the subtle dynamics that played out in the luxury cabin. She understood that her job was not just about safety and service, but about managing the egos and expectations of passengers who paid extraordinary amounts of money to avoid the inconveniences that ordinary people accepted as part of travel. Sofia was proud of her professionalism, proud of her ability to handle difficult situations with grace and diplomacy, and proud of the fact that she had worked her way up from economy-class service to the most exclusive flights in the company's fleet. She had seen entitled passengers demanding celebrities and powerful executives who expected the world to rearrange itself for their convenience, and she had learned how to navigate those personalities without compromising her own integrity. But Sofia had never encountered a situation quite like this one, where her professional instincts were pulling her in one direction while the pressure from a powerful passenger was pushing her in another. She could see that Cameron and Devin had legitimate boarding passes, that their behavior was completely appropriate, and that they were causing no problems for anyone. She could also see that Victoria Ashworth was becoming increasingly agitated, and she knew from experience that agitated, wealthy passengers could make life very difficult for flight crew members. Rachel Thompson had been working as a gate supervisor for 8 years, and she had built her reputation on her ability to handle VIP passengers with the kind of personal attention that made them feel special and important. She understood that in the luxury travel business, perception was often more important than reality, and that maintaining the right atmosphere was crucial for keeping high-paying customers satisfied and loyal to the airline. Rachel had studied every passenger manifest, memorized the preferences and peculiarities of frequent flyers, and prepared detailed notes about dietary restrictions, seating preferences, and special requests. She had arranged for Victoria's favorite champagne to be available before departure, ensured that the cabin temperature was set to her preferred level, and personally confirmed that every detail of the flight service would meet her exacting standards. When Rachel looked at Cameron and Devin Mitchell, she saw a potential disruption to the carefully orchestrated experience she had planned. Their casual dress seemed out of place in the refined environment. Their presence appeared to be causing distress to one of her most important passengers, and she began to worry that their flight might become the kind of incident that generated complaint letters and negative reviews. Miguel Santos had been working alongside Sofia for 6 years, and he had developed a deep respect for her professionalism and judgment. He watched the interaction unfolding between Sofia and Victoria with growing concern, sensing that the situation was moving beyond normal passenger relations into territory that could become problematic for everyone involved. Miguel had grown up in a working-class family in Miami, and he had experienced enough discrimination in his own life to recognize the subtle signs when he saw them. He could see that Cameron and Devin were being treated differently than other passengers, not because of their behavior or their documentation, but because of assumptions being made about them based on their appearance. Dr. Amanda Foster occupied seat 2A, and from her position she had a clear view of everything happening in the forward cabin. As a pediatric surgeon who had spent 15 years working in emergency rooms and operating theaters, she had developed an ability to assess situations quickly and accurately, to see past surface appearances, and focus on what was actually happening rather than what people wanted her to see. Dr. Foster had noticed Cameron and Devin when they boarded because their quiet confidence reminded her of the brilliant young residents she worked with at the hospital, people whose intellectual capabilities were often underestimated because they didn't fit conventional expectations of what success was supposed to look like. She had also noticed Victoria's reaction to their presence, and her medical training had taught her to recognize the signs of irrational fear and prejudice. The first confrontation began with Victoria's voice cutting through the ambient noise of the cabin like a knife through silk. Sophia, she called her tone, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who was accustomed to having service personnel respond immediately to her requests. "I need to speak with you about the seating arrangements in this cabin." Sophia moved gracefully down the aisle, her professional smile in place, her posture conveying both respect and competence. "Of course, Mrs. Ashworth. How can I assist you this afternoon?" Victoria's eyes flicked toward Cameron and Devon, then back to Sophia, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of careful modulation that wealthy people used when they wanted to sound reasonable while making completely unreasonable demands. "I'm concerned about the passengers in seats 1A and 1B. Are you certain they belong in first class? They look rather urban, don't you think?" The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished match, leaving behind the acrid smell of something that had burned too quickly and too hot. Sophia felt her stomach clench as she realized that Victoria was asking her to judge the worthiness of other passengers based on their appearance to make decisions that had nothing to do with airline policy and everything to do with personal prejudice. Mrs. Ashworth Sophia replied carefully, her training kicking in as she tried to navigate between professional obligation and personal discomfort. "All passengers in the first-class cabin have been confirmed to have valid reservations and proper documentation. Is there a specific service issue I can address for you?" Victoria's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose slightly, and her smile became sharper, more calculating. "Darling, I've been flying on this airline longer than you've been working here, and I know what first-class passengers are supposed to look like. Those two men are clearly out of place, and I don't feel comfortable with them sitting so close to me. Surely there's something you can do about this situation." Sophia glanced toward Cameron and Devon, who were quietly reviewing documents on their electronic devices, completely absorbed in their work and causing no disruption to anyone around them. She could see their boarding passes on the small tables beside their seats, clearly marking them as legitimate first-class passengers. She could see their behavior, which was entirely appropriate and professional, and she could see that Victoria's concerns had nothing to do with any actual problem, and everything to do with assumptions she was making based on their race and their clothing. "Mrs. Ashworth." Sophia said, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension in her chest. "I can assure you that all passengers in this cabin have been properly verified. Is there anything else I can do to ensure your comfort during the flight?" Victoria's expression hardened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of warning that Sophia had heard before from passengers who were accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and influence. "Sophia, I think you're missing the point here. I'm not asking you to debate passenger policies with me. I'm telling you that I don't feel safe with those people sitting behind me, and I expect you to address this situation appropriately. I know the management of this airline personally, and I'm certain they would want their most valued customers to feel secure and comfortable during their travel experience." The tension in the cabin shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous as Victoria Ashworth's complaints grew louder and more insistent, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of having her demands met without question. She had repositioned herself in her seat so that she could maintain visual contact with Sophia while keeping Cameron and Devon in her peripheral vision like a predator tracking potential threats while coordinating with allies. "I want you to understand something very clearly." Victoria continued, her voice dropping to the kind of low, intense tone that wealthy people used when they wanted to ensure their words carried maximum impact. "I didn't pay $25,000 for this seat to feel uncomfortable or unsafe during my flight. Those men are making me nervous with their presence, and I expect you to do something about it immediately." Sophia found herself trapped between competing loyalties and professional obligations, knowing that her response in the next few minutes could determine not just the immediate outcome of this situation, but potentially her entire future with the airline. She had seen what happened to crew members who upset VIP passengers, how complaints from influential travelers could derail careers and destroy reputations within the close-knit world of luxury aviation. Cameron Mitchell looked up from his laptop screen as Sophia approached their seats, his dark eyes meeting hers with the kind of calm attention that suggested he was accustomed to dealing with tense situations and unexpected complications. His expression showed no anger or defensiveness, just the quiet patience of someone who had learned to let other people reveal their true character before deciding how to respond. "Gentlemen," Sophia began, her voice carefully neutral, but carrying an undertone of apology, "I need to verify your boarding documentation one more time, just as a routine security procedure. Would you mind showing me your boarding passes and identification again?" Devon looked up from his own work, his expression shifting from concentration to mild confusion as he processed Sophia's request. "Is there a problem with our reservations? We checked in online this morning and received our boarding passes without any issues." Sophia felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment as she realized how her request must sound to passengers who had done nothing wrong and were being singled out for additional scrutiny for no legitimate reason. "It's just a standard verification process that we sometimes use for our most exclusive flights. Nothing to be concerned about." Cameron reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet that looked deceptively simple, but had actually been handcrafted by the same Italian artisans who made accessories for European royalty. From it, he extracted his boarding pass, his identification, and a black credit card that carried no visible branding, but was recognized by luxury establishments around the world as a symbol of virtually unlimited financial resources. "Here you go," Cameron said, handing the documents to Sophia with the same calm courtesy he would have shown to a colleague or business partner. "I think you'll find everything is in order." Sophia examined the boarding passes, which clearly showed confirmed reservations for seats 1A and 1B with all fees paid and no restrictions or special notations. She looked at their identification documents, which were valid and matched the names on the reservations exactly. She held the credit card, briefly noting its unusual weight and the subtle holographic security features that marked it as belonging to a tier of financial privilege that most people never encountered. As Sophia was conducting her verification, Rachel Thompson appeared in the cabin doorway, having been summoned by a discreetly sent text message from Victoria. Rachel's appearance at the aircraft represented an escalation in the situation, bringing ground-based supervisory authority into what had been a cabin management issue. Mrs. Ashworth Rachel said, approaching Victoria's seat with the kind of deferential attention that VIP passengers expected, and demanded, "I understand there may be some concerns about the cabin arrangements. Please tell me how I can assist in resolving this situation to your satisfaction." Victoria's posture straightened as she recognized that her concerns were now being taken seriously by someone with real authority to make changes. "Rachel, I'm so glad you're here. I've been trying to explain to Sophia that I have serious security concerns about the passengers in seats 1A and 1B. They don't belong in this cabin, and their presence is making me extremely uncomfortable." Rachel glanced toward Cameron and Devon, taking in their casual clothing, their focused attention on their electronic devices, and their calm demeanor in the face of increasing scrutiny. What she saw didn't match Victoria's description of threatening behavior, but she also saw Victoria's obvious distress and understood the potential consequences if a passenger of her stature decided to file a complaint or take her business elsewhere. "Let me review the situation," Rachel said, pulling out her tablet and accessing the passenger manifest for the flight. Her screen showed detailed information about every traveler, including their reservation history, payment methods, and any special notations or requests. As Rachel scrolled through the data, she could see that Cameron and Devon Mitchell had booked their seats 3 weeks earlier, had paid the full first-class fare without using any discounts or upgrades, and had a travel history that showed previous flights on luxury airlines with no incidents or problems noted in their records. Dr. Amanda Foster had been watching the interaction with growing alarm, recognizing the patterns of discrimination that she had witnessed in her own professional environment. when patients or families made assumptions about healthcare providers based on their age, race, or gender. She discreetly activated the recording function on her phone, understanding that documentation might become important if this situation continued to escalate. Miguel Santos positioned himself where he could observe the interaction while remaining available to assist Sophia if needed. His years of experience in customer service had taught him to recognize when situations were moving beyond normal passenger relations into territory that could become legally problematic for everyone involved. Mrs. Ashworth Rachel said after reviewing the passenger information, "I can see your concerns, and I want to assure you that we take all security matters very seriously. Let me speak with these passengers directly to better understand the situation." Rachel approached Cameron and Devon with an expression that attempted to balance professional courtesy with underlying suspicion, her body language conveying the message that she was prepared to be reasonable, but was also ready to take decisive action if necessary. "Gentlemen, I'm Rachel Thompson, the gate supervisor for this flight. I need to ask you a few questions about your travel plans today, just to ensure that everything is properly documented and that all our passengers feel comfortable and secure." Cameron closed his laptop and gave Rachel his full attention, his demeanor remaining calm and cooperative, despite the obvious implication that he and his brother were being treated as potential problems rather than paying customers. "Of course. What would you like to know? Can you tell me the purpose of your travel to London?" Rachel asked, her tone suggesting that this was a routine inquiry rather than an interrogation based on passenger complaints. "We have a business meeting tomorrow morning with European defense contractors," Devon replied, his voice carrying no emotion beyond polite cooperation. "We're scheduled to finalize a cybersecurity contract that's been under negotiation for several months." Rachel made notes on her tablet, creating a record of the interaction that could be used later to justify whatever actions she decided to take. "And what is the nature of your business? What type of cybersecurity work do you do?" Cameron exchanged a brief glance with his brother before answering both of them, recognizing that they were being asked to justify their presence in ways that other passengers had not been required to do. "We own a company that provides cybersecurity services to government agencies and major corporations. We protect critical infrastructure from digital threats." I see Rachel said, though, her expression suggested skepticism rather than understanding. "And you're traveling in first class today because—" The question hung in the air like an accusation, its implications clear to everyone within hearing range. Rachel was asking them to justify their right to occupy the seats they had purchased, to explain why they deserved the same level of service and comfort that was automatically assumed to be appropriate for other passengers. Devon felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced countless times when his presence in expensive restaurants, exclusive hotels, or high-end retail establishments had been questioned by people who couldn't believe that someone who looked like him could legitimately afford to be there. "We're traveling in first class because we bought first-class tickets," Cameron said, his voice remaining steady, but carrying a subtle edge that suggested his patience was beginning to wear thin. "The same reason anyone else travels in first class, I would assume." Victoria had been watching this exchange with growing satisfaction, pleased to see that her concerns were being taken seriously and that the airline staff was conducting a proper investigation into the situation. She decided that the time had come to provide additional information that would help Rachel understand the seriousness of the security threat. Rachel Victoria called, her voice carrying across the cabin with the clarity of someone accustomed to having her words given immediate attention. "I think you should know that these men have been whispering together in what sounds like code since they boarded. They're clearly planning something, and I don't think it's safe for them to remain in this cabin with other passengers." Dr. Foster looked up sharply at this latest accusation, having observed Cameron and Devon's behavior throughout the boarding process, and knowing that Victoria's characterization was completely false. The brothers had been quietly reviewing business documents and occasionally exchanging brief normal conversation, nothing that could reasonably be interpreted as suspicious or threatening. Sophia felt her stomach drop as she realized that the situation was spiraling beyond anything that could be resolved through normal customer service procedures. Victoria's accusations were becoming more serious and more specific, creating a record of alleged security concerns that would be difficult to ignore or dismiss. Miguel Santos moved closer to the group, positioning himself where he could serve as a witness to whatever happened next, and potentially provide support for his colleague if the situation became confrontational. Rachel felt the weight of decision pressing down on her as she realized that she was being forced to choose between the complaints of a wealthy, influential passenger and her own professional judgment about two travelers who appeared to be completely legitimate and appropriate. The choice seemed clear from a business perspective, but she found herself struggling with the ethical implications of what she was being asked to do. "Gentlemen," Rachel said, her voice carrying a new note of authority and finality, "I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft while we complete a more thorough verification of your reservations and conduct an additional security screening. This is a precautionary measure to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers." The words hit Cameron and Devon like a physical blow, not because they were surprising, but because they represented the culmination of a pattern of discrimination that both brothers had hoped they had finally escaped through their success and achievement. Devon Mitchell was 12 years old when he learned that intelligence, politeness, and good intentions meant nothing if you happened to be standing in the wrong place while black. He had been browsing in the Apple Store at the upscale Aventura Mall in North Miami, fascinated by the latest iPad display, and lost in the wonder of technology that seemed almost magical to his young mind. His parents had given him $40 for good grades, and he was trying to decide whether to buy accessories for his older iPod or save the money toward something bigger and better. The store was crowded with families enjoying their Saturday afternoon shopping, children playing with demo devices while their parents discussed purchase options with sales associates. Devon had been standing in front of the tablet display for maybe 15 minutes, carefully reading through the technical specifications and trying to understand the differences between the various models when he felt a heavy hand land on his shoulder. "All right, kid. Time to move along." "The security guard," said his voice, carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested this was a routine interaction rather than an unusual intervention. "You've been standing here way too long, and we don't allow loitering in the store." Devon looked up at the guard, a middle-aged white man whose uniform and badge marked him as mall security rather than store personnel, and felt confusion wash over him like cold water. "I'm not loitering, sir. I'm a customer. I'm trying to decide what to buy with my birthday money." The guard's expression didn't change, and his hand remained firmly planted on Devon's shoulder, a physical reminder of the power dynamic that had suddenly shifted in the bright, cheerful space. "Kids like you don't have money for Apple products, son. You're probably just in here trying to figure out what you can grab when nobody's looking. Time to go." The words hit Devon like a slap across the face, not just because of their cruelty, but because of their complete dismissal of everything he knew himself to be. He was an honor student, a voracious reader, a kid who spent his free time teaching himself programming languages because he was fascinated by how computers worked. He had never stolen anything in his life, never even considered it, and the suggestion that he was a potential thief simply because of his race felt like being punched in the stomach. "Please, sir," Devon said, his voice starting to shake as he realized that the situation was escalating beyond his ability to control it. "I have money. I can show you. My parents are shopping in Nordstrom, and they told me I could look at electronics while they tried on clothes." But the guard wasn't listening anymore, and other shoppers were beginning to stare as the confrontation became more visible and more uncomfortable. Devon could see the expressions on their faces, some showing sympathy, others displaying the kind of suspicious interest that suggested they believed the security guard's assessment of the situation. "Hands where I can see them," the guard commanded, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "Turn around and put your hands against the wall. We're going to wait right here until the police arrive and sort this whole thing out." Devon felt his world collapse as he was forced to assume the position against the Apple Store's gleaming white wall, his face pressed against the cool surface while his hands were roughly searched and his pockets turned out. The $40 his parents had given him was discovered and confiscated as potential evidence, and his school identification was examined with the kind of suspicious scrutiny usually reserved for obviously fraudulent documents. By the time his parents arrived, summoned by store management who were growing uncomfortable with the scene playing out in their retail space, Devon was sitting in the mall security office with handcuffs around his wrists, waiting for police officers who had been called to investigate a potential juvenile shoplifting incident. The charges were eventually dropped when it became clear that Devon had committed no crime beyond shopping while black, but the damage to his 12-year-old psyche was permanent and profound. He had learned that his intelligence meant nothing if people chose to see him as a threat, that his character could be dismissed based on assumptions about his appearance, and that the world he was growing up in operated according to rules that had nothing to do with fairness or justice. That night, lying in his bed and staring at the ceiling while his parents argued in the kitchen about lawyers and lawsuits and whether they could afford to move to a different neighborhood, Devon made a promise to himself that would shape the rest of his life. He would become so successful, so undeniably accomplished, that no one would ever again be able to dismiss him based on assumptions about who they thought he was. Cameron Mitchell's awakening came 16 years later when he was 24 years old and standing in the lobby of a Fortune 500 corporation wearing his best suit and carrying a briefcase full of presentations that could revolutionize their cybersecurity infrastructure. He and Devon had spent 3 months developing a proposal that would protect the company's intellectual property from foreign hackers, and they had been invited to present their ideas to the board of directors. Cameron had arrived early, partly because punctuality was important to him, and partly because he wanted a few minutes to review his notes and calm his nerves before the biggest presentation of his career. The lobby was impressive, all marble and mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of downtown Miami, and he stood quietly near the reception desk while waiting to be called upstairs. The security guard who approached him was young, probably no older than Cameron himself, with the kind of eager intensity that suggested he was new to the job and determined to prove his worthiness to his supervisors. His uniform was crisp and his badge was polished, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who believed he was protecting something important from potential threats. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, positioning himself between Cameron and the elevator bank that led to the executive floors. "Are you here for the IT support call? Because the service elevator is around the back, and you'll need to sign in with facilities management before you can access the building." Cameron felt a familiar clenching in his stomach as he realized what was happening, the same sensation Devon had described from his experience at the mall years earlier. Here he was dressed in a $1,500 suit and carrying documentation that proved his appointment with the company's highest-level executives, and he was being mistaken for a technician because his presence in the lobby didn't match someone's expectations. "I'm not here for IT support," Cameron replied, keeping his voice calm and professional despite the anger building in his chest. "I have a meeting with the board of directors. My name is Cameron Mitchell, and I'm here to present cybersecurity solutions." The guard's expression didn't change, and his posture remained firmly planted between Cameron and the elevators, as if he were a physical barrier that couldn't be moved through explanation or documentation. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and verify your appointment through the proper channels. We've had issues with people trying to access unauthorized areas of the building." Cameron produced his driver's license, his business cards, and the email confirmation of his appointment, watching as the guard examined each document with the kind of suspicious scrutiny that suggested he was looking for evidence of forgery rather than verification of legitimacy. Other visitors to the building walked past them and straight to the elevators without being stopped or questioned their right to be there, apparently obvious in ways that Cameron's was not. "I'm still going to need to call upstairs and confirm this appointment," the guard said, though Cameron could see from his expression that he remained skeptical about the whole situation. "Why don't you have a seat over there while I sort this out?" Cameron found himself directed to a waiting area near the lobby entrance, as far from the executive elevators as possible, while still being technically inside the building. He sat in an uncomfortable chair and watched other business people come and go, all of them treated with the kind of automatic respect and access that he had been denied, despite having the same level of legitimate business in the building. 20 minutes later, a white colleague from Cameron's company arrived for the same meeting and was immediately escorted to the executive floor without question or delay. It was only when this colleague vouched for Cameron's identity and legitimacy that the security guard finally reluctantly allowed him access to the meeting that he had been invited to attend. The presentation went well, and Cameron and Devon eventually won the contract that would establish their company as a major player in the cybersecurity industry. But the humiliation of being treated like a potential threat in the lobby of a building where he was supposed to be welcomed as a business partner left scars that never fully healed. That night, Cameron and Devon sat in their shared apartment and talked about their experiences, about the patterns of discrimination they had each encountered, and about the ways that success and achievement seemed to offer only limited protection against the assumptions that people made about them based on their appearance. They made a pact that evening, a commitment to building something so significant and so powerful that they would never again be in a position where their legitimacy could be questioned or their right to occupy any space could be challenged. They would not just succeed. They would become so successful that the institutions that had tried to exclude them would have no choice but to acknowledge their worth. TechGuard Solutions was born from that conversation, from the determination to create not just a business, but a fortress of achievement that would protect them from the kind of humiliation they had experienced throughout their lives. Every contract they won, every client they protected, every breakthrough they achieved was motivated not just by professional ambition, but by the deeper need to prove that they belonged in any room they chose to enter. Now sitting in the first-class cabin of Platinum Elite Airways Flight PE-007, facing the familiar pattern of suspicion and discrimination that they had hoped their success would finally eliminate. Both brothers felt the weight of all those years of struggle and determination pressing down on them like a physical force. They had built a company worth billions of dollars, protected national security infrastructure from foreign attacks, and earned the respect of government officials and corporate leaders around the world. But here they were once again being asked to justify their presence in a space they had paid to occupy once again, facing the assumption that they didn't belong where they were. The irony was not lost on either of them that they were traveling to London to sign a contract that would make them responsible for protecting the cybersecurity infrastructure of NATO countries. Yet they couldn't board an airplane without having their right to first-class accommodations questioned by people who knew nothing about their capabilities or achievements. But this time, things would be different. This time, they had resources and options that hadn't been available to 12-year-old Devon standing against the wall in an Apple store, or 24-year-old Cameron sitting in a corporate lobby while his legitimacy was questioned. This time, they had the power to do more than just endure discrimination. They had the power to make it impossible for anyone else to experience what they were experiencing. The security escalation began with Captain James Walsh's voice crackling through Rachel Thompson's radio, his tone carrying the weight of 25 years of aviation experience and the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives at 30,000 feet above the ground. "Rachel, I need you to clarify the nature of this security concern before we can proceed with departure preparations. If we have passengers who pose a legitimate threat, I need to know about it now." Rachel pressed the radio to her ear, acutely aware that Victoria Ashworth was watching her every move, and that her response in the next few minutes would determine not just the immediate outcome of this situation, but potentially her standing with one of the airline's most valued customers. "Captain Walsh, we have a passenger who has expressed serious security concerns about two individuals in the first-class cabin. She believes their behavior has been suspicious and potentially threatening." Cameron Mitchell looked directly at Rachel as she spoke into her radio, his dark eyes holding an expression of calm intensity that suggested he was recording every word for future reference. He had spent enough years dealing with corporate politics and bureaucratic maneuvering to recognize when a situation was being deliberately escalated beyond what the facts would support. Officer Maria Gonzalez arrived at the aircraft within minutes of Rachel's call, her uniform crisp and her demeanor professional as she boarded the plane to assess the situation that had been reported as a potential security threat. Maria had 15 years of experience in airport security, and she had learned to approach these calls with an open mind, understanding that passenger complaints didn't always reflect actual security concerns. "Good afternoon," Maria said, addressing the entire group that had gathered around the disputed seats. "I understand there's been a report of suspicious behavior. Can someone explain to me exactly what happened and what the specific concerns are?" Victoria Ashworth immediately positioned herself as the primary complainant, her posture and tone conveying the authority of someone who expected law enforcement to take her concerns seriously and act on them promptly. "Officer, I've been watching these two men since they boarded, and their behavior has been extremely suspicious. They've been whispering together in what sounds like coded language, and they refuse to provide adequate explanation for their presence in first class." Maria looked toward Cameron and Devon, taking in their calm demeanor, their appropriate dress, and their obvious cooperation with the investigation process. Nothing about their behavior or appearance suggested any kind of threat or inappropriate conduct, and she began to suspect that this call might be more about passenger preferences than legitimate security concerns. "Gentlemen," Maria said, approaching Cameron and Devon with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she was conducting a routine inquiry rather than an interrogation, "I need to ask you a few questions about your travel today. Can you show me your identification and boarding documents?" Cameron reached into his jacket and withdrew his wallet, extracting his passport, driver's license, and the black credit card that had been the subject of earlier scrutiny. Devon produced similar documentation, and both brothers handed over their materials with the kind of calm cooperation that suggested they had nothing to hide and nothing to fear from official scrutiny. Maria examined the documents carefully, noting that everything appeared to be legitimate and properly issued with no signs of alteration or forgery. The passport showed extensive travel history with stamps and visas from countries around the world, suggesting that these were experienced international travelers rather than people who might be unfamiliar with security procedures or travel protocols. "Can you tell me the purpose of your trip to London?" Maria asked, her tone remaining neutral and professional as she conducted what was essentially a routine passenger screening that should have been unnecessary under normal circumstances. "We have a business meeting tomorrow morning with European defense contractors," Devon replied, his voice carrying no emotion beyond polite cooperation. "We're finalizing a cybersecurity contract that's been under negotiation for several months." Maria made notes on her tablet, creating an official record of the interaction that could be referenced later if questions arose about how the situation had been handled. "What type of cybersecurity work do you do, and who are you meeting with specifically?" Cameron exchanged a glance with his brother before answering both of them, recognizing that they were being asked to provide information that went far beyond what would normally be required for passenger screening. "We own TechGuard Solutions, a cybersecurity firm that provides services to government agencies and major corporations. Tomorrow we're meeting with representatives from several NATO countries to finalize a contract for protecting critical infrastructure systems." Officer David Kim arrived as backup, having been called when Maria radioed for additional assistance in handling what had been reported as a potentially serious security incident. David was younger and less experienced than Maria, with only 5 years in airport security, and he approached situations with the kind of aggressive caution that sometimes created problems where none had existed before. "What's the situation here?" David asked, positioning himself where he could observe both the passengers and the airline personnel while maintaining a clear path to the aircraft exit if rapid evacuation became necessary. Maria briefed David on what she had learned so far, explaining that the passengers appeared to have legitimate documentation and reasonable explanations for their travel, but that another passenger had expressed specific security concerns about their behavior and presence in the first-class cabin. Victoria watched this exchange with growing satisfaction, pleased to see that her complaints had resulted in serious law enforcement attention, and that the situation was being handled with the gravity she believed it deserved. She decided that the time had come to provide additional details that would help the officers understand the full scope of the threat. "Officers," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of authoritative concern that suggested she was providing crucial information for their investigation. "I think you should know that one of these men made what sounded like a threatening phone call earlier. He was speaking very quietly, but I heard him mention something about executing a plan and taking control of operations. I believe they may be planning some kind of coordinated action." Dr. Amanda Foster felt her blood pressure spike as she listened to Victoria's increasingly elaborate and obviously false accusations, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond simple discrimination into territory that could result in serious legal consequences for innocent people. She had been discreetly recording the interaction on her phone, and she realized that her documentation might become crucial evidence if this situation resulted in arrests or other official actions. Miguel Santos positioned himself where he could serve as a witness to whatever happened next, his years of experience in customer service having taught him to recognize when situations were spiraling beyond normal passenger relations into territory that could have serious legal and professional implications for everyone involved. The atmosphere in the cabin became increasingly tense as more authority figures arrived, and the scope of the investigation expanded beyond simple passenger screening into what appeared to be a comprehensive security assessment. Other passengers began to take notice of the commotion, with some expressing concern about flight delays, and others appearing genuinely worried about the possibility of security threats. Captain Walsh decided that the situation had become serious enough to warrant his personal attention, and he left the cockpit to assess the circumstances that were threatening to delay his flight and potentially compromise the safety and security of his aircraft and passengers. "I need someone to explain to me exactly what's happening here," Captain Walsh said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who was ultimately responsible for every decision that affected his aircraft and everyone on it. "We have a schedule to maintain, and I need to know whether we have legitimate security concerns or passenger relations issues that can be resolved through normal procedures." Rachel Thompson found herself in the uncomfortable position of trying to explain a situation that had escalated far beyond what the facts would support, while also managing the expectations of a VIP passenger whose complaints had triggered the entire investigation. Captain Mrs. Ashworth has expressed serious concerns about the behavior of the passengers in seats 1A and 1B, and we're conducting a thorough investigation to address those concerns. Cameron Mitchell had been listening to this escalating series of accusations and investigations with the kind of patient attention that suggested he was allowing other people to reveal their true character before deciding how to respond. But when Captain Walsh asked for a direct explanation of the situation, Cameron decided that the time had come to introduce some facts that might change the trajectory of the conversation. Captain Walsh Cameron said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who was accustomed to addressing high-level executives and government officials, "My brother and I are traveling to London on legitimate business with proper documentation and valid reservations. We've cooperated fully with every request for information and verification, but we're being treated as potential security threats based on complaints that appear to have no foundation in actual facts." Captain Walsh looked directly at Cameron, taking in his calm demeanor, articulate speech, and obvious education and sophistication. Nothing about Cameron's presentation suggested any kind of threat or inappropriate behavior, and the captain began to suspect that this situation might be more complicated than it had initially appeared. "Officer Gonzalez," Captain Walsh said, "in your professional assessment, do these passengers represent any legitimate security threat to this aircraft or its other passengers?" Maria had been conducting security screenings for 15 years. and she had developed an expertise in assessing actual threats versus perceived problems based on passenger complaints. In her professional judgment, Cameron and Devin Mitchell represented no security risk whatsoever, and she was beginning to feel uncomfortable about the level of scrutiny they were receiving. "Captain, I see no evidence of any security threat," Maria replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who was stating her professional opinion based on careful observation and experience. "These passengers have proper documentation, reasonable explanations for their travel, and have been completely cooperative throughout this process." Victoria Ashworth felt a spike of alarm as she realized that the investigation was not proceeding in the direction she had expected, and that the security personnel were not automatically accepting her assessment of the threat posed by Cameron and Devin's presence. She decided that the time had come to make her concerns more explicit and more urgent. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Victoria declared, her voice rising to a level that carried throughout the cabin and into the jet bridge where additional passengers were waiting to board. "I'm not going to fly on an aircraft with people who make me feel unsafe regardless of what their documentation says. If you cannot guarantee my security and comfort, then I demand that they be removed from this flight immediately." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, creating a moment of absolute silence as everyone present processed the implications of what Victoria was demanding and what their response would reveal about their own values and priorities. Cameron Mitchell reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and visible to all the security personnel present, and withdrew his phone from an interior pocket that contained technology worth more than most people's annual salaries. The device itself looked deceptively simple, appearing to be a standard smartphone, until someone noticed the subtle indicators that marked it as a custom-built communication tool with encryption capabilities that were used by intelligence agencies and heads of state. "I think it's time to make a phone call," Cameron said, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the conversation was about to take a dramatic turn in a direction that none of them had anticipated. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for, then pressed the dial button and activated the speaker function so that everyone present could hear both sides of the conversation that was about to change everything they thought they understood about the situation. The phone rang twice before a professional female voice answered with crisp efficiency, "Tech Guard Solutions Executive Office. This is Jennifer Martinez speaking." "Jennifer, this is Cameron Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who was accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of dollars and thousands of people. "I need you to execute Option 7 immediately." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and when Jennifer spoke again, her voice carried a note of concern that suggested she understood the gravity of what was being requested. "Sir, are you certain about this decision? Option 7 involves approximately $400 million in immediate expenditures, and the consequences will be irreversible once we begin the process." Cameron looked directly at Victoria Ashworth, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her suddenly understand that she might have made a terrible mistake in her assessment of who she was dealing with. "I'm completely certain, Jennifer. Execute Option 7 now, and make sure that all documentation is filed with the appropriate regulatory agencies within the next 30 minutes. "Understood, sir," Jennifer replied, and the sound of rapid typing could be heard through the phone's speaker as she began implementing whatever Option 7 entailed. "I'm initiating the hostile takeover bid for Platinum Elite Airways. Our shell companies currently hold 31% of the outstanding shares, and we're launching a tender offer for the remaining 69% at a premium of 40% over current market value." The words hit the cabin like a physical explosion, creating a moment of absolute silence as everyone present tried to process the implications of what they had just heard. Victoria's face went completely white. Captain Walsh took a step backward in shock, and Rachel Thompson's tablet slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. Jennifer Cameron continued, his voice maintaining the same calm, professional tone he had used throughout the entire conversation. "Please make sure that our legal team is prepared to file discrimination charges against any personnel who participated in today's events, and begin the process of reviewing all existing contracts and employment agreements for airline staff. Devin Mitchell had been watching the proceedings with the same calm attention as his brother, but now he spoke for the first time since the security investigation had begun, his voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who had been pushed beyond his limits and was ready to respond with the full force of his capabilities. Jennifer Devon said, addressing the voice on the phone, also contact our friends at the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Transportation. I think they need to know about the discriminatory practices that are apparently standard operating procedures for this airline. Victoria Ashworth found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper as the full magnitude of her situation became clear. You can't be serious. You can't just buy an entire airline because of a simple passenger complaint. Cameron looked at her with an expression that might have been pity if it hadn't been so completely devoid of sympathy. Ma'am, we just did. And this wasn't a simple passenger complaint. This was organized discrimination carried out by multiple airline employees against paying customers, documented by witnesses and recorded for evidence. This is exactly the kind of institutional bias that Option 7 was designed to address. The helicopter appeared on the horizon exactly 18 minutes after Cameron Mitchell's phone call, its sleek silhouette cutting through the Miami afternoon sky like a mechanical bird of prey descending toward its target. The aircraft bore the corporate logo of Platinum Elite Airways, but everyone watching from the terminal windows understood that the power dynamics of the company had shifted dramatically during the brief time it had taken the aircraft to fly from downtown Miami to the airport. Mark Richardson, Chief Executive Officer of Platinum Elite Airways, emerged from the helicopter with the kind of hurried efficiency that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation he was walking into, and that his response in the next few minutes would determine whether he still had a job by the end of the day. Richardson was a seasoned aviation executive with 30 years of industry experience, but he had never faced a crisis quite like this one, where a routine passenger complaint had somehow triggered the hostile takeover of his entire company. Richardson's assistant, a young woman whose expression suggested she had been briefed on the situation during the flight from corporate headquarters, hurried alongside him carrying a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained legal documents, financial reports, and crisis management protocols that had been hastily assembled to address an unprecedented corporate emergency. As Richardson approached the aircraft, Captain Walsh emerged from the cockpit to brief him on the situation from his perspective as the pilot in command who had been dealing with what had initially appeared to be a routine security screening, but had somehow evolved into a corporate acquisition that was apparently being conducted in real time on his aircraft. Mr. Richardson. Captain Walsh said, his voice carrying the strain of someone who had been trying to maintain professional composure while managing a situation that had spiraled far beyond anything his training had prepared him to handle. I think you need to understand exactly what's been happening here before you speak with the passengers. Richardson listened intently as Captain Walsh provided a rapid summary of the events that had led to his emergency summons to the airport, his expression growing increasingly grim as he realized the legal and financial implications of what his staff had apparently done to two passengers who turned out to be among the most powerful cybersecurity executives in the world. Meanwhile, inside the aircraft cabin, Victoria Ashworth sat in stunned silence as the reality of her situation continued to sink in with the relentless progression of a nightmare from which she could not wake up. Her carefully constructed world of privilege and entitlement was collapsing around her like a house built on sand, and she was beginning to understand that her actions had triggered consequences that would extend far beyond this single flight. Dr. Amanda Foster continued to record the proceedings discreetly, understanding that she was witnessing a historic moment where discrimination had finally triggered consequences that were proportional to the harm it caused, and that her documentation might become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that would inevitably follow these events. Sofia Rodriguez and Miguel Santos stood together near the galley, both of them recognizing that their careers and reputations were hanging in the balance as their supervisors and executives tried to assess their roles in the discrimination that had triggered this crisis and determine whether they were part of the problem or potential allies in finding a solution. Rachel Thompson remained near the boarding door, her face pale and her hands shaking as she realized that her decision to side with Victoria Ashworth's complaints had apparently cost her not just her job, but possibly her entire career in the aviation industry, since her new owners would undoubtedly review her personnel file and her role in today's events. Officer Maria Gonzalez and Officer David Kim remained on the aircraft to serve as neutral witnesses to whatever resolution was about to be implemented, though both officers were beginning to understand that they had been called to investigate a situation where the real criminal behavior had been committed by airline personnel rather than by the passengers they had been asked to screen. Mark Richardson boarded the aircraft with the kind of deferential urgency that executives display when they know they are walking into a situation where their company has committed serious legal violations and their personal survival depends on their ability to demonstrate immediate and decisive corrective action. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell Richardson said, approaching Cameron and Devon with an expression that combined profuse apology with desperate hope that the situation could somehow still be salvaged. I want to personally apologize for the completely unacceptable treatment you've received from our staff today. This behavior is absolutely contrary to our company values and our commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Cameron looked up at Richardson with the kind of calm attention that suggested he was evaluating not just the words being spoken, but the sincerity behind them and the likelihood that any promised changes would actually be implemented and sustained over time. Mr. Richardson. Cameron replied, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who was prepared to be reasonable but was not willing to accept empty apologies or meaningless promises. The treatment we received today wasn't the result of individual employee mistakes. It was the predictable outcome of institutional policies and cultural attitudes that your company has apparently cultivated and tolerated for years. Devon nodded in agreement with his brother's assessment, adding, "The question now isn't whether you can apologize for what happened. The question is whether you're prepared to implement the kind of comprehensive changes that will ensure this never happens to anyone else." Richardson felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force, understanding that his response would be scrutinized not just by the Mitchell brothers and their legal team, but eventually by regulatory agencies, civil rights organizations, and the traveling public who would learn about these events through social media and news coverage. "Gentlemen," Richardson said, "I want to assure you that we will conduct a thorough investigation of today's events, and that appropriate disciplinary action will be taken against any employee who violated company policy or engaged in discriminatory behavior." Cameron exchanged a glance with his brother before responding, both of them recognizing the standard corporate language that executives used when they wanted to sound responsive, while avoiding specific commitments or timelines that could be used to hold them accountable for follow-through. Mr. Richardson, Cameron said, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. We don't need you to investigate what happened because we've already documented everything through witness testimony and recordings. We don't need you to promise future changes because we're going to implement them ourselves. And we don't need you to discipline your employees because we're going to be making those decisions directly." The implications of Cameron's words hit Richardson like a physical blow, as he realized that the hostile takeover wasn't just a negotiating tactic or a threat designed to motivate better service, but an actual corporate acquisition that was apparently proceeding according to a predetermined plan that would give the Mitchell brothers direct control over every aspect of the airline's operations. Jennifer Devon said, speaking to the phone that was still connected to their corporate office, "Can you give Mr. Richardson a status update on the acquisition timeline?" Jennifer Martinez's voice came through the speaker with the kind of crisp efficiency that suggested she was multitasking between multiple complex financial and legal procedures while conducting this conversation. "Certainly, Mr. Mitchell. The tender offer was filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission 22 minutes ago, and we've already received acceptance from institutional investors representing an additional 38% of outstanding shares. We now control 69% of Platinum Elite Airways, which gives us operational control of the company effective immediately. Richardson felt his knees go weak as he processed the speed and efficiency with which his company had been acquired, understanding that the Mitchell brothers had apparently been prepared for this scenario and had already developed the financial and legal infrastructure necessary to execute a hostile takeover within minutes of deciding to proceed. Mr. Richardson Cameron said, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the conversation was moving toward specific decisions and immediate actions you have a choice to make right now. You can work with us to implement the changes necessary to ensure that no passenger ever experiences what we experience today, or you can look for employment elsewhere. But what you cannot do is continue operating this airline according to the policies and practices that created today's situation. Victoria Ashworth had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, realizing that her complaints had not just failed to result in the removal of Cameron and Devon from the aircraft, but had actually triggered their acquisition of the entire airline and put them in a position to make decisions about her own future as a passenger and customer. "This is insane," Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of desperate disbelief as she tried to process the rapid reversal of fortune that had transformed her from a powerful customer whose complaints carried weight into a problem passenger whose behavior was being reviewed by the new owners of the airline. "You can't just take over a company because you didn't like the service you received." Devon looked at Victoria with an expression that might have been educational if it hadn't been so completely lacking in sympathy. "Ma'am, we didn't take over this company because we didn't like the service. We acquired it because your false accusations of criminal behavior combined with the willingness of multiple airline employees to act on those accusations without evidence created a clear pattern of institutional discrimination that could only be addressed through direct ownership and operational control." Cameron reached into his jacket and withdrew a legal document that had apparently been prepared in advance and was now being implemented as part of the corporate takeover. "Mrs. Ashworth, effective immediately, you are permanently banned from traveling on any aircraft operated by this airline. Your frequent flyer account has been closed, your accumulated miles have been forfeited, and any future attempts to book passage will be declined." The words hit Victoria like a series of physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the privilege and status that had defined her identity for decades. The realization that she had destroyed her own access to the luxury travel that had been an essential part of her lifestyle was almost too devastating to process. "You can't ban me," Victoria protested, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested she was losing control of her carefully maintained composure. "I'm a valued customer. I've been flying with this airline for years. I have rights." "You had rights." Devon corrected, his voice carrying the quiet finality of someone who was stating facts rather than engaging in negotiation. "You chose to forfeit those rights when you made false accusations against paying customers based on their race and appearance. Actions have consequences, Mrs. Ashworth, and these are yours." Rachel Thompson stood frozen near the boarding door as she realized that her turn for consequences was approaching rapidly, and that her decision to support Victoria's complaints rather than follow airline policy and her own professional judgment was about to cost her everything she had worked to achieve in her aviation career. Ms. Thompson Cameron said, addressing Rachel directly for the first time since the situation had begun, "Your employment with this airline is terminated effective immediately. You will be escorted from the aircraft and the airport, and your access credentials will be revoked. Your personnel file will include detailed documentation of your role in today's discrimination, which will be available to any future employers who request references." Rachel felt her world collapse as she realized that her career in aviation was over. Not just with this airline, but potentially with any carrier that conducted proper background checks on employees who would be working with passengers from diverse backgrounds. "Please," Rachel said, her voice breaking as she tried to find words that might somehow minimize the consequences of her choices. "I was just trying to respond to a passenger complaint. I was following what I thought was the right procedure." Cameron looked at Rachel with an expression that was completely devoid of sympathy or forgiveness. Ms. Thompson, you chose to act on discriminatory assumptions rather than following established airline policies. You chose to escalate a situation based on the appearance of passengers rather than their behavior or documentation. Those weren't procedural errors. Those were character failures, and they have permanent consequences. Sofia Rodriguez stepped forward, understanding that her own future was about to be decided and wanting to address the situation directly rather than waiting for judgment to be rendered by others. Mr. Mitchell, I know that my role in today's events was inappropriate, and I accept responsibility for failing to protect passengers from discrimination. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you'll consider allowing me the opportunity to learn from this experience and to be part of implementing better policies in the future. Cameron studied Sophia's expression, recognizing the genuine remorse in her voice and the courage it had taken for her to step forward and acknowledge her mistakes rather than making excuses or trying to shift blame to others. Ms. Rodriguez Cameron said your employment will continue, but you'll be required to complete comprehensive sensitivity training and bias recognition programs. You'll also be assigned to work with our new passenger advocacy department to help develop policies and procedures that prevent discrimination and ensure that all travelers are treated with dignity and respect. Miguel Santos felt a wave of relief as he realized that his decision to remain supportive of his colleague while expressing discomfort with the discrimination he was witnessing had apparently been noted and appreciated by the new owners of the airline. The cabin atmosphere began to shift as the immediate consequences were implemented, and the reality of the power transfer became clear to everyone present. The Mitchell brothers had not just survived an attempt to discriminate against them. They had transformed that discrimination into an opportunity to implement the kind of comprehensive changes that would prevent future passengers from experiencing similar treatment. Dr. Foster approached Cameron and Devon as the formal proceedings concluded, wanting to express her admiration for how they had handled a situation that could have ended in arrest and legal complications for them, but instead had resulted in justice and institutional reform. Gentleman, Dr. Foster said, I want you to know that I recorded much of what happened today, and I'll be happy to serve as a witness if any legal proceedings arise from these events. What I witnessed was unconscionable, and I'm grateful that you had the resources and determination to address it so comprehensively. Cameron shook Dr. Foster's hand, recognizing her courage in documenting discrimination, even when doing so might have put her in an uncomfortable position with airline staff and other passengers. Dr. Foster, your documentation and witness testimony will be crucial for ensuring that today's events are properly investigated and that the legal consequences are appropriate to the violations that occurred. Thank you for your integrity and courage. As the immediate crisis resolution concluded and the aircraft prepared for its delayed departure to London, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented in the aviation industry. Discrimination that had triggered immediate comprehensive consequences that extended far beyond individual punishment to include institutional reform and ownership transfer that would prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. 3 months after the events of Flight PE-007, the aviation industry was still reverberating from the comprehensive changes that Cameron and Devon Mitchell had implemented throughout Platinum Elite Airways. Changes that had spread like ripples through the entire luxury travel sector, as other airlines scrambled to avoid becoming the next target of similar corporate acquisitions motivated by discrimination complaints. The transformation of Platinum Elite Airways had been swift and thorough, guided by the Mitchell brothers' understanding that superficial policy changes would not be sufficient to address the deep-rooted cultural problems that had made Victoria Ashworth's discrimination possible and had encouraged airline employees to act on her complaints rather than following established procedures and professional standards. The first major change had been the implementation of mandatory body cameras for all passenger-facing employees, a policy that ensured every interaction between airline staff and travelers would be documented and available for review if complaints or incidents arose. The cameras were not presented as punishment for employees, but as protection for everyone involved, creating accountability that benefited both passengers and staff members who conducted themselves professionally. Sofia Rodriguez had completed her required sensitivity training and had been promoted to Director of Passenger Advocacy, a newly created position that gave her authority to investigate discrimination complaints and implement corrective actions in real time rather than waiting for lengthy corporate review processes that often resulted in problems being minimized or dismissed. The bias recognition training that Sophia had developed working with civil rights experts and academic researchers had become the gold standard for airline employee education, focusing not just on obvious forms of discrimination, but on the subtle assumptions and unconscious prejudices that could influence how passengers were treated based on their appearance, accent, or perceived social status. Miguel Santos had been promoted to senior flight attendant and had become the lead instructor for the new customer service protocols that emphasized dignity and respect for all passengers, regardless of their dress, age, race, or apparent wealth. His training sessions used real-world scenarios, including detailed case studies of the events surrounding Flight PE-007, to help employees understand how discrimination could escalate and how their individual choices could either contribute to or prevent discriminatory treatment. The independent review board that had been established to investigate discrimination complaints included representatives from civil rights organizations, academic institutions, and passenger advocacy groups, ensuring that future complaints would be evaluated by people who had no financial or professional incentive to minimize or dismiss legitimate concerns about discriminatory treatment. Dr. Amanda Foster had accepted an invitation to join the airline's Diversity Advisory Board, bringing her expertise in high-pressure decision-making and her first-hand experience as a witness to discrimination to the development of policies that would protect future passengers from experiencing what Cameron and Devon had endured. The legal proceedings that had followed the events of Flight PE-007 had resulted in significant financial settlements for the Mitchell brothers, though they had donated most of the monetary awards to organizations that worked to combat discrimination in transportation and hospitality industries, preferring to focus on creating institutional changes rather than personal enrichment from their traumatic experience. Rachel Thompson had struggled to find employment in the aviation industry after her termination, with her role in the discrimination incident making her unemployable at most major airlines that conducted thorough background checks on customer-facing personnel. She had eventually found work in a completely different field where her experience served as a daily reminder of the career-ending consequences that could result from allowing personal prejudices to influence professional decisions. Victoria Ashworth's attempts to book passage on other luxury airlines had been complicated by the industry-wide sharing of information about passengers who had been involved in discrimination incidents, and she had discovered that her reputation had spread throughout the exclusive travel networks that she had once taken for granted. The social media coverage of the incident had made her recognizable to airline employees and other passengers, forcing her to confront the reality that actions driven by prejudice could have lasting consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The financial impact of the discrimination incident had been devastating for Victoria personally, as the Mitchell brothers' acquisition of Platinum Elite Airways had led to a comprehensive review of all corporate relationships and partnerships. Her ex-husband's pharmaceutical company, which had significant business relationships with TechGuard Solutions, had quietly terminated several consulting contracts and investment arrangements that had been providing Victoria with ongoing income from their divorce settlement. Most significantly, Victoria's investment portfolio, which had been managed by financial advisors who emphasized luxury and lifestyle investments, had included substantial holdings in hospitality and travel companies that had been negatively affected by the industry-wide scrutiny of discriminatory practices that had followed the Mitchell brothers' corporate acquisition. The new policies implemented at Platinum Elite Airways had been adopted voluntarily by several other major airlines, as industry leaders recognized that the Mitchell brothers' response to discrimination had demonstrated both the legal vulnerability and the financial risks that airlines faced when they failed to protect passengers from prejudicial treatment. The Federal Aviation Administration and Department of Transportation had launched their own investigation into discriminatory practices in the aviation industry, using the documentation and testimony from Flight PE-007 as a foundation for developing new regulatory requirements that would make anti-discrimination training mandatory for all airline employees and require regular audits of passenger treatment policies. 6 months after the incident, Cameron and Devin Mitchell finally made their rescheduled trip to London, traveling on their own airline with a crew that had been personally trained in the new passenger advocacy protocols they had developed. The flight proceeded without incident, with every passenger receiving the kind of respectful professional service that should have been standard throughout the industry from the beginning. The NATO cybersecurity contract that had been the original purpose of their trip had been successfully negotiated and implemented with TechGuard Solutions, becoming the primary digital security provider for critical infrastructure systems throughout Europe. The irony was not lost on either brother that they were now responsible for protecting the cybersecurity of multiple nations while having been treated as potential security threats simply because they had chosen to dress comfortably during their travel. The merger between TechGuard Solutions and the European defense contractors had proceeded as planned, creating a global cybersecurity network that protected critical infrastructure in more than 30 countries. The expanded company employed thousands of cybersecurity professionals from diverse backgrounds, and the Mitchell brothers had implemented hiring and promotion policies that ensured merit and capability would always take precedence over appearance or social connections. The broader impact of their response to discrimination had extended far beyond the aviation industry, as their willingness to use their wealth and influence to address institutional bias had inspired other successful business leaders to take similar stands against discrimination in their own fields. The Mitchell Standard had become shorthand for the idea that economic power should be used to promote social justice rather than simply to accumulate personal wealth. Educational institutions had begun using the case study of Flight PE-007 in business ethics and civil rights courses, examining how discrimination could trigger immediate and comprehensive consequences when victims had the resources and determination to respond effectively. The incident had become a powerful example of how individual choices by employees could have far-reaching consequences for entire corporations when those choices reflected discriminatory attitudes and practices. As the one-year anniversary of the Flight PE-007 incident approached, Cameron and Devin Mitchell reflected on how a routine business trip had transformed their company from a successful cybersecurity firm into a major force for social change in the aviation industry and beyond. They had discovered that their technical expertise in protecting digital infrastructure had prepared them well for the challenge of protecting human dignity from institutional discrimination. The ultimate legacy of their experience was not the acquisition of an airline or the implementation of new policies, but the demonstration that discrimination could no longer hide behind corporate structures or institutional protection when its victims had the knowledge, resources, and determination to expose it and demand comprehensive accountability. Victoria Ashworth eventually found work as a customer service representative at a mid-tier retail company where her daily responsibilities included treating all customers with respect and courtesy, regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. The job required her to confront her own prejudices every day and to practice the kind of non-discriminatory behavior that she had failed to demonstrate during the flight that had changed her life forever. The twins didn't just win their seats back that day, they redesigned the entire system that had tried to exclude them. Their quiet determination to transform discrimination into institutional reform had created changes that would protect countless future travelers from experiencing the humiliation and injustice that they had endured. When children who look like Cameron and Devin board airplanes today, they are greeted not with suspicion based on their appearance, but with the professional respect that every human being deserves, regardless of how they choose to dress or which social class others assume they belong to. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance, then I want you to do something for me. Hit that like button to show your support for justice and equality. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, because stories like this need to be told and retold until discrimination becomes a thing of the past. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, then subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. We're building a community of people who refuse to stay silent when they witness injustice, and your voice matters in that fight. Drop a comment below telling us about a time when you stood up for someone else or when someone stood up for you. Your story could inspire the next person who watches this video. Remember, change doesn't happen when we stay quiet. It happens when we speak up, stand up, and refuse to accept discrimination in any form. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.